19th. It's Monday, and it's 2013. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think this is our third lecture, maybe fourth lecture, and Hort375, creating a sustainability assessment. And so with us today in the classroom, we've got our 10 students, as well as Jed and Jeff Wyman and Dina Knutson. Again, my name is A.J. Busson. I'm the Potato and Vegetable Cropping Systems Specialist in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I have a 70% extension appointment, 30% research appointment, and that means I get to work with the potato and vegetable industry and dealing with some of their major issues, and hence the sort of emphasis of our class. One of the big things that's emerged in the last 5 to 10 years are questions related to sustainability. And of course, our effort here is to try to develop an assessment process and talk through the different steps and challenges that the farm industry, the ag industries are facing with regard to sustainability and trying to document what's been accomplished on the farm scale. So today, I titled the presentation Truth and Assessment. And so part of the reason for that is we're really going to talk about a mechanism whereby we provide legitimacy to the sustainability assessment process. And we mentioned numerous times over the course of the first several lectures about the need for a research-based approach to sustainability and assessing the sustainability of agricultural or farm systems. And so if we think about that in the context of what we're doing, we need to bring the scientific process in terms of how we review our efforts to date, and how do we provide a mechanism whereby people can have some faith and belief in the numbers that are generated. So before we get started, I just remind all of the participants that we're in the webinar portion of the presentation, and so for the next 30-45 minutes, I'll ask you to hold your questions, and then at the end of the webinar, we'll end the recording, and then we'll have open dialogue. Oops. There we go. So for today's discussion, there's really 3 steps that we're going to talk about. The first is how do we choose NGO, a non-government organization, or public agencies to be partners in the process. And we'll talk a bit about why that's an important step. I think in a nutshell, you think about farms and how they exist in the landscape. They're dynamic entities, and they have a social, environmental, and an economic role to play across the landscape. And so there's a lot of vested interest in farming and in farms and how they operate, hence some of the efforts that are underway. We'll also talk about the role of public agencies specifically in conservation programs and sustainability. Today's a federal holiday, and so NRCS is off today, celebrating President's Day, but I did get some information from NRCS, and so we'll share that today in terms of how some of the current programs that are underway intersect with what we're doing in sustainability. And actually, in reality, they have been one of the bigger driving forces in sustainable agriculture for quite a while through the numerous programs that they've been implementing across the landscape. And then finally, we'll discuss options for verification and validation, and we'll discuss specifically about which each of those processes mean and how do we go about trying to provide a process whereby there's faith and there's a belief in what's being reported by agriculture in terms of how they're doing with regard to sustainability and in terms of some of the claims that are made following the assessment process. So I'll just talk briefly about choosing an NGO and a public agency partner. And I think the one thing I go back to, I have a good colleague, Nick Summers. He's a farmer up near Plover, Wisconsin. He's a potato farmer. And for quite a while, he served on the National Potato Council IPM, Integrated Pest Management Subcommittee. And in the late 90s, he was invited to serve on a panel. And on that panel with him were representatives from the World Wildlife Fund and some other groups that are from outside of agriculture but have concerns about how farming and agriculture is done. And up until that point, these folks didn't necessarily communicate real well with each other or at all for a number of reasons. But the reality is they sat down on this panel, and after 30 or 45 minutes, they decided that in reality what they were interested in wasn't all that different. and that there was a lot of common ground. And so I think there are opportunities for agriculture in particular to go out and work with organizations from outside of the producer groups or from outside of the industries. And so I think that's not just a challenge, but it's actually an opportunity for agriculture to help spread and communicate what they're doing, and also get some feedback and input back on how their farm systems operate. And so one of the questions is, how do we go about creating these types of relationships? I think it's important to engage those that are interested in the discussion. And growing number of different agencies or NGOs, process of choosing NGOs and public agency partners, and I've sort of made a justification for why this is important to do. But in terms of the process itself, I think it's important to gauge those that are interested in the discussion about agriculture. And mostly, I think it's important to engage those that are interested in a constructive discussion about agriculture moving forward. Again, there's broader interest in issues related to the production agriculture than just those from the farm gate standpoint. There's a lot of folks from outside, and again, this is because of the entity itself, the farm, and its interaction with the surroundings. I think we discussed the example where there's a lot of common goals and objectives between agriculture and agriculture producers in particular, and some of the non-government organizations and public agency partners that might be out there. And the reality is by engaging in common goals and objectives, then you can create a collective effort and benefit from the expertise and the multiple different perspectives that go through the process. Talking from a non-government organization or talking from somebody outside of agriculture might bring a completely different perspective with regard to how you might solve a problem. And then the last point is it actually provides legitimacy to the process. For a farm organization or for a commodity organization to go out and just claim advances in sustainability without actually engaging somebody from outside of the farm gate in that process can draw some criticism from groups as being things like greenwashing and things of that nature, and not really trying to address our true concerns, but just trying to promote what's currently being done. All right. So where's the interest from the NGOs in sustainable agriculture in particular? And I just listed a number of different groups that are currently engaged in sustainable agriculture discussions across the country. This is by no means all-inclusive, but it is a good start. These are all folks that we have worked with as part of our process at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. These are also folks that some of the NISA participants have been working with over the course of time. I also think you could probably recognize a number that aren't on that list that probably do have interests in what happens with regard to agriculture and the sustainability of American agriculture. In terms of government agencies, I broke these down into multiple groups, and we'll talk about these later, but I think one of the largest agencies, of course, is the United States Department of Agriculture, in particular the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the American Ag Marketing Service, the CSRES, which is the Research and Extension arm of USDA, and of course Ag Research Service. But there are other groups as well. EPA actually falls under the guise of USDA, but it is independently operated. Same with Food and Drug Administration. Different agencies are also concerned with regard to USGS, and of course, it also goes down to county governments and local governments as well, or state governments. If I think about the state of Wisconsin, we might think of the Department of Natural Resources. A number of other states have similar departments, or departments of Fish and Wildlife, etc. And then at the county level, you might have things like land conservation offices, which are actually county-appointed positions to try to address conservation concerns at a local scale. So where are the areas of interest for the non-government organizations with regard to sustainable agriculture? And I think this becomes an interesting part of the discussion. I think what's been a primary focus for a number of years, maybe 20 to 25 years, are pesticides and fertilizer use. A lot of this came about from the publicity of some of the things that were happening across the agricultural landscape in response to pesticide use in the 60s and 70s, and there's some pretty famous books that are out there that sort of documented it, and for good reasons. A lot of concerns came forward about residues and food safety. Of course, we also know that those are being regulated and managed currently by EPA and the current herbicide or pesticide labeling process. There's also a lot of concerns that have emerged about water quality impacts, not just from a pesticide standpoint, but from a fertilizer standpoint. And a lot of emphasis on the new Clean Water Act is also, and the Clean Air Act influence what's going on in American agriculture and how we're going to be farming into the future. Then, of course, something that's more recent is a lot of concerns about worker protection. This goes all the way to the next generation of our farm youth, how they grow up on the farm. But for those of us that actually grew up on the farm, you knew that you weren't just living there, you were working there and part of the daily process. Well, that now is starting to come under more and more scrutiny, and I think things have changed for the better in terms of farm safety for young kids a lot over the last several decades. And of course, that becomes an area of interest for different folks as well. You also know about soil and water conservation. This goes all the way back to the 1930s and maybe before, and really the Dust Bowl and what resulted from that is a changing in American farm landscape for the Great Plains, but that's actually spread almost throughout the entire United States and now starting to spread across the world. I'm trying to conserve our soils and try to conserve our water and preserve them for the long-term betterment of our society, as well as the long-term security of our agricultural systems. We're also worried about biodiversity enhancement and protection. This is somewhat new and more relevant, especially as we've seen broad changes in countries outside of the United States, where we've seen large tracts of wooded land or prairie that have been turned under and converted into production agriculture. There's a big concern about loss of biodiversity from those tracts of land. And of course, you know, we've done that over 130, 180 years ago in the United States. And so we're trying to now figure out, well, how do we capitalize on that and how do we manage that biodiversity going forward? Labor rights, we've already mentioned. Worker protection, that's more specific. But labor rights also include whether or not it's equitable and whether or not the labor is represented in the conversations within the business plan. And I think what's amazing to me is to go out, that's probably been the biggest single change in American agriculture over the last 20, 30 years, is how workers are treated at the farmscape now. And the large reason that's because there's a huge demand for trained and skilled talent. And so they are actually becoming partners in the agricultural production system, and it's part of the farm. And I think that's something that, more than anything, we've done a very poor job of communicating relative to some other things. And then, of course, animal husbandry, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but I also think we need to recognize that this is a big concern and a big issue that's starting to grow a lot of attention out there. So I want to put into context how the National Initiative for Sustainable Agriculture is trying to address this. We have this large group of non-government organizations that have vested interest in what's going on in the agricultural landscape and with regard to what's the sustainability of our farm systems are. And then we have this large grouping of interest areas that aren't all that different than the interest areas of the farm industry itself or the farmers themselves. And so what's been amazing to me is to watch over the last several months the development of the National Initiative for Sustainable Agriculture goals and objectives. And if I just listed several or there's actually 6 primary impact areas: productivity and profitability, social, land use, air and water, inputs, energy, and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, outside of productivity and profitability, the other 5 of those all fall under the interest areas that I just mentioned from outside of the farm gate. Well, remember a couple slides ago I said we're trying to find where our common ground is? The common ground is there, right? And so that's the key now is how do we develop a mechanism whereby we can communicate about the common ground and then develop common goals and objectives to move forward and what our true outcomes are and a process for trying to meet that. From these 6 impact areas, there's actually been created over 20 desired outcomes within the NISA process at present. And I think that that's rather remarkable. And it represents a couple things in my mind. One, it represents the complexity of the farm system itself. Now, these are different areas, and I'm sure we'll have opportunity to visit about these more in the future. But these are the areas of specific focus that the farmers themselves, the producers themselves that are participating in the NISA process have identified as critical enough to actually put on the paper and say, you know what, this is something that we have to address for the long-term sustainability of our farm. All right. Okay. So I think that gives us common ground for moving forward, and it also shows a broader commitment by the producers than what we're seeing by individual groups, because many of the individual NGOs just have a specific subset of foci or focal points that they want to put an emphasis on. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind as you go through your process in your class or go through your process in developing your sustainability assessment is what areas of interest do the NGOs have, and are they all represented within the different outcomes that you decide are most important to try to address right away. This is just an example of what those outcome documents look like. And so this happens to be energy and greenhouse gases. And the thing I want to point out is that really there's 4 different desired sustainability outcomes that have been created by the producers. It deals with productivity of direct energy inputs, trying to develop indirect energy inputs into the farm system, improving on-farm energy self-sufficiency. In other words, can farms derive their own energy from their own production systems? And then the final thing is how do we optimize carbon, nitrogen, and other greenhouse gas related cycles within our farm system? And then it provides potential ways to measure or indicate through the outcomes process how do we measure each of these different outcomes. And then in the far right column, it gives example metrics that have been created through other processes, through public agencies, or through other mechanisms. And so what I think it does to show is the sophistication and the level of thought and commitment that the producers are putting into this. And I'm talking about common ground. Instead of going out and saying to one of the NGOs, well, we'd like you to partner with us, we can go out as a farm group or as a farm organization or our producer organization and say, this is the outcomes that we're committed to. This is how we're going to try to indicate whether or not we're having success, and these are the metrics that we're going to use. It changes the dynamics of the conversation from the beginning in that process. So creating a common vision is going back through sort of the different steps of how we create this partnership between the NGOs and the producer associations. Again, we got to identify a common mission, and the outcomes are a great place to start, as I sort of just discussed. We just have to respect the viewpoints of each other. Obviously, there's going to be times when you maybe don't want to hear what the other partner has to say, but at the same time, it requires respectful dialogue to get through that process and to figure out a mechanism where your common ground is and how do we move forward. And that's kind of important to create common principles. I do think that a non-starter for most of the farm organizations is they aren't hoping to create more regulatory processes. A number of things are already regulated. In terms of think about pesticide use. We already have pesticide labels that have been created, embedded through the process that's been developed by EPA. Do we need to go beyond that? And what's the specific justification for going beyond that? And is that something that the NGO and the farm organization can agree upon? And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is we have a large array in dynamic agriculture. We have folks that are very far advanced in the sustainability of their production system with regard to specific characters, and we have other farms that aren't nearly as far along. The reality is we want to try to move all of agriculture going forward, right? And so we can't go in tomorrow and expect wholesale change and shift in how things are being done. But if we can identify common goals, then we can try to figure out, well, what are the incremental steps to try to get to where we want to go? This creates similar policy positions, hopefully, so that when you go, the farm organization, the NGO goes to talk about what's going on, they can try to point out and highlight the same agreeable points. And I think there has to be respect for the process. Identify the opportunities where we can work together, identify where the barriers are, and then discuss how do we overcome the barriers. But don't make that be a showstopper. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is how do we keep the barriers and the disagreements from becoming showstoppers? How do we overcome those over time and respect that those differences exist, but understand we have a same common objective in mind? In terms of in trying to engage the NGOs, is try to respect the current role and responsibilities of the farm organization with respect to the NGO. Identify the capacity to participate in the process, try to engage in organizational discussions up front in terms of how we're going to try to begin the process. We want the farm right now within the NISA process. The producers have been trying to organize themselves to the point where they develop their process and their thoughts to the point where it's sophisticated enough to share it with the NGO. That's the key step. Well, if you think about the farm organizations and the farm commodities that you might be working with in your projects, that same process is going to have to go forward. The overall approach or opinion with regard to sustainable agriculture should be defined by this point in terms of the common ground and the goals and the objectives that you're trying to accomplish. Some key steps that we've worked through within the NISA group is what's the position on technology or farm practices within the NGO group. And so, for example, a lot of the farms are really concerned, a lot of the farm organizations are concerned about being able to continue to use techniques such as genetically modified crops. Now, there's a large scientific debate raging, basically, I don't know if raging is the right term, but ongoing across the landscape in global agriculture about whether or not genetically modified crops are part of the sustainable process or not. But the reality is they're a fundamental part of American agriculture today. And if we have to respect that going forward. And despite what the science says right now, we don't really have good judgment on what the impacts are, all of them. We have to respect where American agriculture is at, and we have to take into account that the importance of that technology and other farm practices within the farm gate before we go out and say we can no longer do that. All right. So I'm going to skip and I'm going to talk now more about the role of government agencies, and I sort of alluded to these more than once. First of all, there's our regulatory organizations. If we think about the federal level, we have EPA, FDA, APHIS. For example, I mentioned herbicide or pesticide labels. I'm a weed scientist by training, so herbicides always become the priority for me. So excuse me for that. But EPA basically provides a label for use for all pesticides that are utilized in American agriculture. And so part of that process is it goes through, they actually mention it, the precautionary principle in the process for trying to establish safe and fair use for those pesticide products. Now, some groups would rather see those labels become much more stringent and go much further beyond the current limitations that have been imposed by EPA. But the reality is that EPA does have the ultimate authority. In terms of, there's also state organizations. In terms of the state of Wisconsin, we also have the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. I'm going to use pesticide labels again. So pesticide labels are approved by EPA to follow and try to manage the risk associated with the use of the product relative to the benefit. Well, every pesticide that's labeled at the federal level also has to receive state approval. Does that all make sense? And so it's more than just a federal, it's also a state process. And there's also mechanisms whereby states can get special labels for crops that might not be as broadly used. So you have regulatory organizations within the government agencies. You also have support agencies. And so I'm an extension specialist. Jed's an extension specialist. Jeff was an extension specialist. We're actually a support agency. We have no regulatory process. Our goal, our role is actually go out and educate producers and ag industry about management systems, for example, or whatever the case might be. We also have CSRES and ARS as an example. Their primary mission is to provide research support for agriculture as well as extension support. So actually part of my funding for my salary comes through CSRES, and then there's another wing that's Ag Research Station where they actually have USDA ARS scientists all across the country that are doing research related to agriculture and agricultural systems. The last group is USDA NRCS, and of course there's more than these groups that I've listed here, but I just put these as an example because USDA NRCS is actually one of the first, is primarily responsible for implementation of the conservation programs in agriculture across the country, as well as in non-agricultural lands. And they do that through a combination of educational programs, local support, but then there's also incentive programs to try to provide economic support for implementation of conservation practices. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides. So I want to focus on USDA NRCS because I think it's a good example of an agency that we can partner with through the sustainability assessment process. If it was formerly known as the Soil and Water Conservation Service back when I was in college in the 1980s, and they started out basically with the premise of trying to map the soils across the entire country. So I'm sure everybody has heard of soil classification maps, right? Where do you go find them? You log into NRCS. That's where they're harbored, right? And all of them are online now, so they're easy to get access to. You can go over to the fourth floor of the Steenbach Library, and that whole upstairs is almost committed to all the soil conservation maps for most of the United States. You have mapping of soil, and then the other thing that has evolved out of NRCS over time is a program that promotes land conservation. And so they were really fundamental in going out and changing farming practices after the Dust Bowl to try to maintain vegetation to prevent wind erosion or water erosion. Again, I mentioned it's an incentive-based program. There's federal funds that are distributed through the local offices. And so most of the counties have different USDA offices, or either the NRCS or the Risk Management Office. And they're linked to the farm-based program payments and other farm subsidy payments and have been for quite some time. And what does that mean? So if a farm actually enrolls into base farm acreage payments or into LDP payments or some other type of program, or for crop insurance, then they're required to implement conservation programs and conservation plans on their property. One of the things we will spend a little bit of time talking about is we're seeing a bit of a transition in NRCS, because up until this point it's been almost exclusively a incentive-based process. Well, several years ago they passed the 590 nutrient management standard. And so standard isn't necessarily a word we use a lot in this class, because most of what we're trying to do is a sustainability assessment. Standard has a different connotation. They have to do some type of minimum steps. So this is a change in terms of how NRCS is implementing some of their programs going forward. So what do the incentive programs look like? They're cost share programs. A lot of times there's a pay part of the cost. For example, I grew up in southwestern Wisconsin, and we were part of the Galena River watershed. In the 1970s, the NRCS decided that they wanted to do a watershed scale effort to try to clean up the water quality in the Galena watershed. And so we got cost share to put retention walls in below all of our cattle lots to try to prevent any manure runoff. We also got funding to come in and redo all of our grass waterways. We actually had a ditch where I could have stood up as a 7-year-old boy and reached up to the top of it, not been able to see out of the ditch that had been cut through the running off of the water in the spring of the year, and that was all replaced with different mechanisms to try to prevent water erosion. And then our whole farm was contour stripped, and so that wasn't the cost that our farm could absorb and get quick recovery on. A lot of times the conservation programs are sort of incremental long-term payback in terms of how fast you see a return on your investment. And so part of the reason the cost share is put into place is to ease the economic burden on trying to implement that process, as well as to try to provide incentive to go out and do it. There's also a lot of water preservation concerns now in addition to soil conservation, and that's where the nutrient management program comes in. We're also seeing efforts outside of Wisconsin, probably more so than in the state of Wisconsin, on air quality. One of the more recently emerging efforts is in wildlife management, and then also in land preservation. We're seeing state and federal programs actually trying to maintain farmland preservation and things of that nature to make sure that we keep American agricultural productive lands in production rather than lost to urban development or for other reasons. Well, so it's kind of interesting if you start to go look at what's going on within NRCS. There's multiple steps that are available, and one of the most visible is what they call their practice or their technical guides, which actually gives growers specific mechanisms whereby they can go out and actually do land or soil or water conservation. I just picked this one as a tillage practice guide because it really does a good job of illustrating the point of how these bulletins are attempted to work. So the first question that might come to your mind is well, A, where do these come from? And B, are they research-based? So I sort of led you into that question, right? So the key is that most of the times it's a partnership between NRCS and state extension that creates these activities. And so there's been research for decades on different tillage practices and how they manage and affect, in this case, residues. And so if you look on the right-hand side of the photos, that's actually different tillage systems, like no-till or strip tillage, and then the impacts on the surface residues. Now, why does that become important? Well, this is about land conservation, and we start to get slopes above 2%. Water starts to run off of those lands when we get heavy rainfalls. Heavy rainfalls, depending on soil texture, might be 1/3 of an inch, might be 1/2 of an inch, depending on what the soil moisture is to begin with. Once we start to get water movement, then it starts to pick up soil particles and move it with the water, right? Well, by maintaining the residues on the surface of the soil, then we start to intercept the raindrops. And so instead of having raindrop bombardment that actually suspends the soil into the water, the residues prevent that from happening, and as a result, the water that either infiltrates as it doesn't run off as quickly because it's got to go through all that residue, or B, it slows down the water either from the air or as it moves across the soil landscape, and C, it changes the amount of suspended soil within the water as it moves. And so these are actually different than, this was one of the things that actually happened on my farm as well, because we moldboard plowed up until 1976. Right? How much residue is left after moldboard plowing? About 2%. Right? Almost our entire farm is over 3% slope, all but about 15 acres. And so when we did that, we also got support in purchasing and conservation tillage equipment. And that was a little bit different sort of a mechanism, but it also was fundamentally part of the Galena River Watershed project. So this photo I put up there is actually 3 different conservation practices visible in this photo. So this is the sand soils of central Wisconsin. We're planting sweet corn. And so what we're seeing here is just basically NRCS in action. And if we look at the trees in the back, that's a shelter belt. That's cost shared. The planting of those trees along roadsides, along field edges. What does that do? It slows down the wind. You see the living green plant material, that's a growing cover crop. Another soil conservation practice. It builds soil organic matter, also provides soil ground cover. And then you notice that the planter is actually planting directly into the rye cover crop. And so it's not been tilled. So this is a no-till conservation management system. And so there's actually 3 different conservation programs that are illustrated in that single photo. And all of those are part of NRCS soil and water conservation programs that are currently being utilized in vegetable production, for example, in central Wisconsin. And we could go across just about every farm industry in the country and do this. Show photos that are very similar to this, where you see multiple factors. Now, the question becomes, how is this being communicated? Are we telling anybody that we're going through this level of effort? Is NRCS going out there and telling everybody we have 95% of the farmers in central Wisconsin that utilize these 3 practices? No. Right? They're not. And so part of what we have to do, part of the reason we have to do the sustainability assessment process and start to think about it is this is success. We have to communicate this. And so that's sort of the impetus behind what we're trying to do in photos. One of the other things that you see, so those are sort of practice-based or technical bulletins on how to manage. One of the other things that has emerged over the last several decades in NRCS is trying to predict what the impact of different practices are. So Russell 2 is a fairly common prediction model. It actually is used to predict soil erosion based on the practices that are being implemented. You can go into the NRCS website and you actually upload it. And you can go to the Russell 2 site and you can download the model and you can start to play around with it if you actually really want to. Otherwise, you can work with your local NRCS agent to figure out how do we manage soil erosion on my farm. It uses the information on the soils. Remember we talked about NRCS has the soil maps, right? So they can take your farm property, if they know your boundaries, they know the soils, they can start to predict based on what your national soil classification is, what your slope, what your soil series is, what the erodibility of that land is in response to different practices and different climatic conditions, if that makes sense. And then we can also look at what the impact of the farm operations, whether it be tillage, cropping patterns, residue, right? A lot of things what we focus on now as a farm community is maintaining crop residues at a certain percentage for so many months out of the year. And it's really critical during spring for many parts of the country because that's when the greatest water erosion potential is. That's also feeds into the 590 nutrient management standard. And so it's actually designed to try to manage the impacts of nutrient applications, both fertilizer applications and non-traditional fertilizer applications are items such as manure, which is used a lot in different parts of the country, in particular Wisconsin and other areas. So we take our information on the nutrients that we're applying and we combine that with the potential for soil or water loss. Many of the state extension organizations, the state extension services, are working with the state NRCS groups to come up with site-specific identification of what the potential losses are going to be based on, again, site-specific soil characteristics derived from the maps, but then also the predictions from Russell 2 in terms of what the runoff potential is. So now if we know how many nutrients we've applied, we can start to make predictions on what the nutrient loads are within the soil, and then we can make estimates on how much soil we actually lose in response to different practices that we're implementing on our farm. Now all of a sudden, instead of saying, well, we're sustainable because we've gone out, we've done this research on soil and water conservation, and we know that maintaining residues does this and this and this, we actually start to put a number to it. And so there's some efforts that, and so what I hope you start to see is that up until this point, we've talked about practices in terms of the photo with those shelter belts and the cover crop and the no-till. Well, now we can actually go out and say, well, wait a minute, it goes beyond that. We have an estimate for what our impact might be. And so what this does is it allows us to start creating nutrient management, best management practices. So we can create recommended rates that try to optimize crop performance, which are basically how almost all nutrient management recommendations are currently being developed, but then start to balance it with the crop requirements. Okay, so let me say that again. So we create PMPs so we can make recommendations on application rates, and those recommendations are derived based on what the crop-specific requirements might be. So if you take classes like mineral nutrition of plants or crops or things of that nature, that's where we get into the specifics of that, but that becomes a central role focus when we talk about different aspects of sustainability assessment within our process. Some of the challenges that we're facing, both between the producer groups and within NRCS and some of the other ag organizations, is that some folks believe this is no longer an incentive-based program. The 590 standards now, for example, in the state of Wisconsin, say you cannot exceed nutrient applications beyond what's optimal for the soil or what the crop removes. And so they put limits on what farmers can actually apply. And so, and there's many believe that once a standard is established, that that's basically the next step towards a regulation. And so if you recall, what is it, the third slide, I said one of our principles within the sustainability assessment process from a farm's organization standpoint is we're trying to not add regulation to the process. On the same time, some of your environmental organizations are saying it's not stringent enough. So there's been a lot of effort in the state of Wisconsin with 590 standards, in particular with regard to phosphorus management. And there's a lot of people that are very encouraged by the amount of effort that's gone into this and the outcomes that have occurred. But then there's other folks that are saying, well, wait a minute, we're still accumulating phosphates in our water bodies. And so this becomes an issue. And that the phosphorus levels are still too high in the surface runoff. And so now we're talking about the next step. We've identified where the common ground is. This is what we can do together between NRCS and the farm organization, and the NGO can start to provide input. But now we've come to the barrier. Now we've come to the key step. Where's the next step? Because the farm organizations say, well, if you start to limit us more, it's going to cost us productivity. It's going to cost us in terms of our inputs. It's going to add to our, and it's going to take away from our profits. And so, and the environmental groups are saying, well, wait a minute, it's not good enough yet. And so this is where some of the challenges start to emerge as an example of where we're going. One of the things that the University of Wisconsin Extension is doing with the Wisconsin NRCS and the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection and the University of Wisconsin has created SNAP Plus. This is the model that takes Russell 2 with the nutrient management BMPs, with all the manure applications, all the fertilizer applications that are being used to make predictions on what the phosphorus runoff is off of specific fields in the state of Wisconsin. This is currently active and being used, and this model is run before any 590 program is put into place, where any nutrient management plan is put into place with a given farm in the state of Wisconsin. So this is seen as a resolution for the challenge, for how we move forward. And this is the challenge that you're going to face in trying to create your own sustainability assessment, for example, with nutrient management at FET. This just goes and looks at all of the different steps that go into the SNAP Plus. You get the input from the field by field crop, and so soil information maps, the rest of tool soil loss equations down at the bottom, and then there's a management loop in there in terms of what's being done with terms of tillage, what the crop is, what fertilizer being applied. It calculates what's called a P-index. And then from that P-index, then we get some gauge or identification of what the sensitivity is or what the likelihood is that phosphorus will run off. So we started with practices, right? We talked about going out and doing shelter belts and cover crops and no-till. And then we talked about the 590 standard, how it sort of evolves and what it's trying to do, and then a very specific process whereby we manage nutrient management. And then the final step, and this gets to the top of the tier structure, is actually, well, how do we go out and correct for what we've already developed through the 590 standard? And so, for example, at the University of Wisconsin, we have this entity called Discovery Farms. And they go out and they do on-farm measurements to look at, well, these are the fertilizers, these are the inputs being applied, this is the productivity of the crops. You look at the middle of the picture, you see instrumentation that's out there in the waterway actually measuring the amount of runoff and the nutrient load and the sediment load in the runoff. And then you see in the bottom right where there's actually differences in data in terms of how the Discovery Farm is performing relative to the state average. And so when we go out and we implement all the conservation programs, how does it actually function? And so it just looks at surface runoff on the left-hand chart, the blue line being the state average. You see in this example the Jersey Valley average just decreased. And then more importantly, the right-hand graph actually looks at the amount of suspended sediment. And that's related to the amount of nutrients that are in the sediment, because it's attached to the soil. It's the amount of the nutrient runoff, and you see that it's reduced by over 90% in this case in this Discovery Farm. And so we create the standard, or we create the practice, we measure the outcome, and then we go out and we try to refine the outcome. And so if we think about a validation and a verification process, we have at the very base what we did. 2, we have a number we put to it, right? 3, we go out and actually work with the farm to verify whether or not what we predict is actually working on the landscape. And then secondarily, what can we do to go beyond what we're currently are implementing as a minimum? How can we move forward in a way that's profitable to the farm and yet also protective of the environment? And so it's kind of creating the 3-tier structure that Dina introduced last week in that triangle. And this is it in practice for this specific example. So this is, I just want to switch now, what do I got left? 10 minutes? All right, so a verification and validation process. So there's several steps that become important in this. So now we're talking about how do we develop, up to this point we've been talking about how do we develop our assessment tool, right? How do we engage our NGO? How do we engage the government organizations or agencies that are interested in what's going on in the farmscape? We looked at a specific example for how this could be implemented in a process. Now I want to talk more specifically about verification and validation of the farm. And so there's questions about what's the truthfulness in the data that's been collected. How accurate are those outcomes? Is Russell 2 right? Is SNAP Plus right? And then what's the accuracy in those outcome predictions? So precision talks about, are they close together? Are we consistently in the same vicinity? And the second, accuracy, is about, well, is it actually truly predicting what we anticipated to? And then finally is the ground truth of the outcome predictions. So I just went through that process or how it might work for nutrient management, but now we've got to create a process whereby we implement this in your assessment tools. So if we look up the word verification, you Google it, you get all kinds of hits through different websites. But ultimately, it's the verification of the producer data. And verification basically means truthfulness. So when a grower fills out or producer fills out an assessment survey or provides assessment data back in, is it correct? And so some folks aren't satisfied with just taking the word of the grower. So some folks actually go out and there's ultimate verification is through certification. There's examples, the USDA Organic Program, the Healthy Grown Potato Program, the Lodi-Woodbridge Wine Grape Program are all certified efforts. There's a number of others that are out there, but these are just 3. The challenge is these require investment. Certification is typically managed privately, either through the association or many folks require third-party certification. So for example, I'm sure you've heard about or aware of organic certifiers that are working in the state of Wisconsin, correct? And they're across the entire country. Who pays those certifiers to come out and certify that a farm is organic? The farmer does, right? So the cost is covered by the grower. Well, at the organic program, for a long time, there's been a premium associated with the organic certification, so there's a return on that investment. And so there's a reason that the grower wants to do it. The Lodi-Woodbridge example, they're also getting a price premium for the certified wine, certified sustainable wine. And that's going back to the wine producer, or the grape producer. It's going back to the grape supplier. And so again, you're seeing payments being made. Now with the Healthy Grown Potato Program, only 1% of the potato crop was sold as healthy grown in 10 years since it was initiated. And there's been no price premium associated with it. So there's been no value associated with the sustainably produced food. And one of the things that we hear continuously is that even though the marketplace and the supply chain is demanding food that's sustainably produced, there's no value associated with it whatsoever. And so if there's no value associated with it, it doesn't seem like certification is a mechanism that's going to work unless you can derive value from it. Therefore, one of the things that we're proposing is a grower affidavit. The grower signs or acknowledges the truthfulness in the data. This eliminates the need for certification, but it could also include ground truthing. Maybe 1 in 1,000 farms, we go back and actually do certification to make sure that the data is correct. This becomes a non-regulatory process. Part of the idea is there's no minimum necessary, and there's no price deduction for failing to meet a minimum. That becomes a pretty important component to this, especially if we're going to have a voluntary assessment process. No farm organization is going to do this willingly if there's a potential for deductions if they fail to meet some minimum. Of course, we need balance between these steps. And so one of the thoughts is to have a self-established set of criteria that can be used to manage this, and also to make sure that there's enough teeth in it, there's a legitimacy in the process. And so that's where we need to go back and actually do some ground truthing to verify that, in fact, the growers are telling the truth and what's going on in their farm operation. Validation is confirm or substantiate in 3 words or less. So verification is truthfulness. We sort of talked about a process that could be used to provide truthfulness in the data collection process. Validation confirms or substantiates what the claims are with regard to the accomplishments. And this ensures that the outcomes are being met. Now, there's multiple techniques to confirm the outcomes. One of the things that's being proposed we're going to talk about in the future is this principal component analysis, and I think Dina sort of alluded to it last week. However, it's only as accurate as the BMPs are that are guiding the process. And we know that the BMPs change as we go from state to state, even within a state. And across soil series, the BMPs change. If we're not accounting for that in the tool, then it's going to be difficult to manage for that within the PCA. There's also an outcome comparison that could be utilized with the PCA. Maybe a subset of growers actually do an outcome-based process. For example, maybe they do a Russell 2 model to predict what their soil loss might be and verify whether or not that falls in line with what the PCA sort of suggests. And then ultimately, there would be the on-farm comparison, sort of as the model we went through previously. So, just like I said, to go back to the NRCS model we talked about. You have the nutrient management BMPs that are being implemented. That's the technical guides, that's the practice bulletins. You have outcome predictions, Russell 2 or SNAP Plus, and then on-farm validation through a process known as this. And the example that was given was the Discovery Farm process that's underway in the University of Wisconsin. Is this something that we can duplicate in our assessment process going forward? Is this something that we have to duplicate in the assessment process going forward? So just to summarize, what I'm trying to do is go through the steps necessary to try to provide legitimacy to the process. In order to do that, you have to engage your critics early. The NGOs are critical of how agriculture is being done. Many of them are constructive in their criticism. So the question becomes, are those groups that we can actually work with and engage in a process as we move forward? I think it's going to be especially true if they understand the current state of agriculture and respect where we've been, how far we've come, and are willing to discuss and chart a path for going forward. I think the other thing to keep in mind is it's going to require incremental shifts. This will require understanding the management systems. Remember, we talked about there's over 20 desired outcomes that we identified through the NISA process. Many of them, if we try to improve one aspect, might have negative ramifications for another one. We haven't even started to discuss some of those things. So how are we going to balance these things? So that's where we're going to have to understand the management system, and we're going to have to make incremental shifts. The other thing is we have to respect the private land ownership, the private business entity that the farms in the United States have become, and have to engage them in that open and constructive process to try to encourage them to move forward in the process, because this is voluntary, likely. This gives us confidence in claims so that when we communicate our progress, there's faith and we can believe in it. And then hopefully what we get through this process is a demonstrated track record of success. Because once we start to establish belief and faith and the truthfulness and the outcomes that are being proposed or are being communicated, and then there's confidence in those claims, then folks have better time believing how we move forward. So with that, I think that's the conclusion of our webinar for today. I appreciate all those folks that joined.